Good morning, and thank you very much for joining us here. I am Bima, researcher of the SMERU Research Institute, and I will be moderating this seminar. And the seminar today is special because usually we have like one speaker for each seminar, for the seminar of the Forum Kajian Pembangunan. But today we will have three distinguished speakers who will share about their papers on the topic of inequality. So it is my pleasure to invite the speakers to join me in front of here. So please, Mas Zulfan Tadjoeddin and Athia Yumna dan Pak Asep Suryahadi come and join me here. And the main topic of the seminar today is the impact of inequality in Indonesia. It is interesting because inequality is becoming an increasing important issue in Indonesia, especially in the era of reformation and decentralization. And we know that the income inequality in Indonesia reached the highest point in recent years, and it is the highest record in Indonesia during the last decade. So the first speaker is Mas Zulfan Tadjoeddin. He holds a master's degree from ISS Den Haag and obtained his PhD degree from the University of Western Sydney, and since then he became a lecturer at the same university, and now he is a senior lecturer in the development studies at the University of Western Sydney. His areas of research include political economy of conflict, peace and development, and inequality and employment. And he also had experiences working with international organizations such as ILO and UNFIRS and UNICEF. And today he will present his one of his paper, collaboration with SMERU researchers, which is the title of his paper is Inequality and Stability in Democratic and Decentralized Indonesia. Our next presenter is one of our senior researchers, which is Athia Yumna. She finished her master's study at the University of Warwick, the UK, and since then, and before she joined SMERU in 2008, and during her time at SMERU, she has involved in many projects, in various projects, especially related to social protection issues. And today, she will give a presentation about the impact of inequality on growth and unemployment, which is based on the project study of the SMERU study with the DVET. Is it correct? Yeah. And our last speaker is Asep Suryahadi. Probably I don't need to introduce him anymore because I think almost everyone here already knows him. And Asep is the director of SMERU, and he has been the director of the institute since 2009. And he already has a large number of publications in journals and also chapters in books. And today he will discuss a paper about inequality, health capture, and targeting of social protection program. This paper is written by our former researcher, Arman Sims, who now is doing a PhD at the Cornell University, and also with collaboration with one of the SMERU researchers, Negara. But since they are not able to come today to present their paper, and Asep will give presentation about the paper. So each speaker will have like about 25 minutes to give his or her presentation, and afterward we will have a discussion session where everyone can raise a question or comments on the presentation. So it is my honor to give the floor to Mas Zulfan for his presentation.
Okay, thank you, Pak Bima and SMERU for inviting me here. I think I'll do my presentation in Bahasa, since my PowerPoint is in English, and the full paper is in English. And most of foreigners here, I'm sure that they are familiar with Bahasa and have been here for many years. So for the benefit of the many, so I'll do my presentation in Bahasa. If you have problem in understanding a particular part of the presentations, please refer to the PowerPoint presentations. If you have problem, I'll make a... Okay. Okay. Okay, no problem, no problem. Okay, no problem if it is the case. I have no choice, because this is the order of the sponsor, so I have no choice. Okay, I'll comply to that one passage, no problem. Okay, so the paper is about inequality and stability in democratic and decentralized Indonesia. So why inequality and stability? Okay. So the first point is inequality. So the rising concern about inequality in Indonesia. So things are different here now compared to say 10-15 years ago. 10-15 years ago, if you keep talking about inequality, you'll be judged to be on the left. And to be on the left is good. The good one is to be on the right. You can ask Ustad or Kiai. The right way is the good way. Now everybody is talking about inequality. Okay? In a recent conference that I attended in Helsinki, in Wider, just a month ago, someone from my bank, from what bank, everyone is there talking about inequality. So inequality has been becoming the issue of the center. So don't worry to be judged on the left, talking about inequality. So there are two important effects of inequality that we need to worry about. One is inequality and prosperity, and the other one is inequality and stability. So we need both. We need stability and we need prosperity. If you don't have one, it will be difficult to have the other. So that's the larger context of this paper. So I'll start with the key conclusions of this paper. The first one is a kind of concluding background, if you like. Economic inequality is high and rising. And 2 days ago, I wrote an article in Jakarta Post arguing that inequality is not only high, it's not only rising, but the true level of economic inequality could be much higher. I'll explain that one in a moment. So because of that one, so there is a long-standing argument or hypothesis saying that inequality is socially destabilizing. Inequality is not good for the social stability or social harmony. And this has been argued long time ago. If you go back to a classic literature in political science, if you read Samuel Huntington, they will say that inequality is bad for political or social stability. The question is not about the argument. The question is about the empirical evidence of that argument. So that will be the focus of the paper. So inequality is socially destabilizing is a kind of more general hypothesis, but the main conclusions of the paper is in the middle. The point in the middle in red and in bigger font, which is we found that higher inequality correlates with higher level of violence and higher level of crime. So why violence, why crime? This is a kind of, we can't measure directly stability. What is the measure of stability? What kind of data that we can use to directly measure stability? Very difficult to have an idea about the index of stability, if you like, Because of that one, instead of looking at the positive indicator of stability, let's look at the negative indicator of stability, which is instability. But what do we mean by instability? Let's concentrate on conflict, violent conflict, or violence, or crime. So that's the idea of the empirical strategy of the paper. So because of that finding, this is a kind of to provide evidence, empirical evidence to say that equality is important, and inequality is something that is not good for social stability, so something must be done about that. And when we are talking about something must be done about that, we have to look at this one on a particular wisdom. Okay, 10, 15 years ago, yeah, the wisdom was, I'm a bit worried that the wisdom is still there now in Indonesia. If you are talking about the policymakers around the monarchs, I'm worried that that kind of wisdom is still there. What was the wisdom? Don't worry about inequality, just concentrate on poverty. When you deal with poverty, by automatically speaking, you will deal with inequality. It's not true. Yeah. And this has been becoming long-fashioned. How can you call it? Traditional, old-fashioned wisdom. People are talking about inequality around the world, especially because of the effect, for example, because of the global financial crisis. Okay, so we can't assume that reducing poverty will automatically reduce inequality. Those two are two different things. This is the main implications of the paper. How to do that? That one is beyond the scope of the current paper. Okay, I'll start the presentation. Okay, this is 2 more minutes about the data. This is simple graph for the past 10 years in Indonesia, showing that declining poverty is happening hand in hand with rising inequality. So this is when you show this kind of diagram, you can say that the wisdom is no longer valid. Okay. So this is my initial data to show that economic inequality is probably much higher than the official current measures of inequality in Indonesia. So that one is, I put together the official measures of Gini coefficients based on Susenas consumption, represented by the blue line, and then you can see that from the red line, that one is inequality of income. Income, the best data to proxy income in Indonesia is income from Sakernas, not income from Susenas. And I've calculated that one, and you can see the level of Gini based on earning data from Sakernas. You can see that one. And overall, for the past 10 years, earning inequality is around 22% higher than Susenas-based consumption expenditure Gini index. Okay, I'll discuss a little bit about the background of the study, and then what do we mean by social stability, and then I'll discuss briefly the literature about inequality and violent conflict, and then I'll talk about empirical strategy, resulting conclusions. But anyway, I've summarized the finding in the first slide. Okay, the background. Okay, rising inequality. And when we go back to the discussions 10, 15 years ago, you can have just one stone and then you will kill 2 birds at the same time. Reducing poverty and at the same time, you reduce inequality. Let me explain it to you this one. Poverty is about if you have 10 ladders, yeah? If you have ladders and you have 10 the first one, second, and third. So poverty is about the bottom ladder of the income distributions. Yes, it is legitimate to concentrate on poverty, but inequality is more than just poverty. Poverty is about the distributions of income across all the income ladders. So, but by conceptions, you can see, yeah, how incorrect it is to just to equate reducing poverty and reducing inequality. And the way to handle those two should be different. You can't put it the same way. So this is the main implications of this thesis. Okay, let's move to the second phrase in the title, about social stability. Why are we concerned about social stability? This is because the situations in Indonesia back to the early phase of democratic transitions. What happened at that time? There was a significant eruptions of violent conflict in Indonesia. So the transitions to democracy in Indonesia was accompanied by a significant level of violent conflict in different parts of Indonesia. Something that only seemed in late 90s, not during the 3 decades of New Order administrations. And then we know that there was an increasing, we call it conflict industry, if you like. New studies on conflict introduced and the new project, things like that. And based on that one, we know that we can create 3 basic categorizations of violent conflict in Indonesia. That is the main source of the instability in this country during the democratic transition. What are the main categories of collective violence in Indonesia? We know that we have separatist violence, we have ethnic violence, and the main object of the study is not those two, but the residual. Because this study is not about the violent conflict during the democratic transitions, but violent conflict or social violence in Indonesia between 2005 and 2012. So after the basic design of decentralizations and the chaotic democratic transitions has passed. So we are talking about the more calm period after democratizations and decentralizations. But we learned these categorizations from the series of violent conflict during the democratic transitions. So we are studying, so that's why the concern about social stability is important, and we need to maintain that one, but in the context of, not in the context of the collapse of an authoritarian regime, but in the context of more power distributed to regions, and in the context of when freedom of speech, freedom of expression has been there in the society. So that's the way we should allocate the study, compared to studying conflict during the democratic transition. I'll skip this one. This is the whole very famous graph from the violent conflict during the democratic transitions, but this is our main focus of the data. So what you can see from these two kind of data, during the democratic transitions, the separatist and ethnic violence are the two dominant categories of social violence in Indonesia. But what happened after 2005? The dominant one was the routine. What is routine violence? Routine violence is different from the ethnic and secessionist violence. This is about the nature of that violence. Ethnic violence, separatist violence, we can call them as episodic violence. Episodic means concentrated in terms of time and concentrated in terms of region. So the residual, if we look at the residual we call the residual is routine violence. What is routine? Routine is the opposite of episodic. Routine means there is no time concentration and there is no regional concentration. So more sporadic, spontaneous, and very much different from the series of ethnic violence, separatist violence that we have in mind, referring to the early period of democratic transition. So this is the data. So there is a clear shifting pattern from the episodic violence during the democratic transitions into the dominance of routine violence after the chaotic transition, decentralization reform has settled. So that's the main conclusions that we can draw from the data. So, now how to link violent conflict or social violence as the proxy for social stability and inequality. Here, the first point that I want to make is we need to match the correct category of inequality and the correct category of violent conflict. If you don't do that, you will get funny results. So there are two types of inequality. The first one is horizontal. I don't think I have time to explain horizontal, vertical, but I can go back to that one in the Q&A sessions. But there are two types of inequality. One is horizontal, inequality between groups, and the second one is vertical. But vertical inequality is the one that is familiar to us. When we talk about Gini coefficient, things like that, we are referring to vertical inequality. In terms of measurements, the measurements of vertical inequality is very much advanced, but the measurements of vertical inequality is contested up until now. The data is not really available, and the concept of the way to measure that one is contested. And then there are two types of violent conflict based on the record of violent conflict during the democratic transition in Indonesia. One is the large-scale episodic violence. We are referring to the separatist and ethnic conflict. And then we have the small-scale routine violence. Okay, so what is the connections? Horizontal inequality is relevant for the episodic violence. And this paper demonstrates that vertical inequality is the one that is relevant to explain routine violence. Okay, this is a brief overview of inequality and conflict. So this is a very old discussions about this one. You can go back to the literature in 1950s, 1960s to trace the link between inequality and conflict, mostly from the sociological or political science literature. But the most important and controversial research about inequality and conflict was the two papers. One by economist Paul Collier in Oxford, and the other one is from political scientist Fearon and Leighton. Both papers are about explaining civil war, the most dominant, the worst form of violence after the collapse of the Soviet Union. So the conclusion of those two very influential papers was the role of vertical inequality in civil war is dismissed. There is no significant effect of inequality and conflict. And after that publications, many people got angry. Come on, how can you say inequality doesn't matter for civil war? So, but on the other hand, on the other side of the crowd, there is Professor Francis Stewart, who invented the concept of horizontal inequality and trying to look at the link between horizontal inequality and civil war or large-scale violence. And it is actually Fearon and Leighton, Collier, Hosler look at the wrong type of inequality. So if you want to explain large-scale civil violence like civil war, similar to the episodic violence that we have during the democratic transitions, we shouldn't look at vertical inequality. Look at horizontal inequality. Okay? So what matters is horizontal inequality. And the literature on this one is growing. Now the question is, should we dismiss totally the role of vertical inequality? And no literature at cross-country study can be found. But we can find it in Indonesia. So the papers finds that the positive and significant effect of rising vertical inequality and higher level of routine violence. So higher Gini, higher vertical inequality is not good for social stability. So that's how this paper tried to put to provide empirical evidence for for the link between inequality and social violence. Okay, this is the empirical strategy. We have violence on the left-hand side, and we have the main explanatory variable that we are interested in, which is vertical inequality. And on top of vertical inequality, we have series of the so-called control variables. But the logic of control variables is to use the so-called the feasibility theory of violence. So, a set of variables that will explain the opportunity for the violence to occur. Okay. What are those controls? I'll show you in a moment. So about the data, this is very important. And this is also compared to 10, 12 years ago, we were at a very early stage of developing data about social violence in Indonesia, but now we have the so-called SNPK, Sistem Nasional Pemantauan Kekerasan. So this is the data gathering now is, if I'm not mistaken, housed at Happiness Center, and under the overall sponsorship of the Coordinating Ministry for Social Welfare. But the data is basically developed by the World Bank. But before that one, the World Bank basically advanced and deepened the data initiated by the UNDP-sponsored project called UNSPIR in early 2000. So that's the history. So the data is well established now. This is the best data on social violence in Indonesia that we can think of. So the data covers not all Indonesia, but only 12 provinces in Indonesia where the SNPK data is available. So those are the map of the 12 provinces. So basically the 12 province refers to the high conflict regions, referring to the record of conflict in Indonesia during the democratic transition. So you can see that we have Aceh, we have Papua, we have Maluku Utara, Maluku, we have Sulawesi, all are hotspots during the democratic transitions. So the observations is across district data between 2005 and 2012, but we put all the district boundaries back to the boundaries of district in the year of 2000 to make a consistent of data. So this is the result. We found a large and significant effect of vertical inequality on routine violence. But the effect is only found after we consider the systematic link between inequality and income, which is Kuznets equation. So it means that we have that kind of effect after doing a kind of two-step regressions. So violence is a function of inequality, and inequality is functions of income. And the link between income and inequality is following the Kuznets hypothesis. And by doing so, and we can find the positive and significant perfect relationship between, not perfect, strong and significant relationship between inequality and violence. And the third finding was, this is just to confirm the previous finding, but basically, we also find a kind of Kuznets type of relationship, but not between inequality and income, but between income and violence. So what we have is this kind of combinations of the three diagrams. So we have the positive relationship between Gini and violence, but in that equations we have Kuznets in between. In the Gini on the right-hand side, we have the Kuznets equations. So the positive relationship between Gini and violence, that will perfectly explain the diagram in the middle. So they are linked. The three diagrams are linked. So, and you can see also here a kind of step-by-step findings in research. We only find the last diagram only in 2012 in the case of Java. Now we confirm that kind of findings in different regions, in different times. So the findings becoming more and more sound. So before we find the third diagram, the positive link between Gini and violence, we only guessed how to explain the inverted U relationship between income and violence. How to explain initially when income rises we have increasing violence, and then after a certain point when income keeps growing, and then we find a declining violence. So how to explain that one? Initially we just explained that one with a kind of intuitive explanations. When we find the third the diagram on the right hand side, we can see. So the one that link income and violence is because of inequality. Why? Because the link between inequality and income is following the first diagram on the left. So this is a very nice combination of the three diagrams. To back up the findings with the data, this is the data. As you may know, the devils are in the detail. So this is the detail of the number crunching, explaining the diagram. What you can see here, 5 minutes, okay. I still have plenty of time. So look at here. In the first and second column, when we treat Gini as it is, not the predicted Gini, the original Gini, the initial Gini, the original Gini, if you like. And then you put also the per capita GDP. You can forget now for the moment the rest of the variables, because I don't have time to go into the details. So what do you have here? We find insignificant effect of inequality, although positive, but insignificant. So inequality doesn't matter. Hard to accept it from the concept, the literature that we have. And then on the other hand, you have positive effect of per capita GDP and violence. Only positive, linear. Hard to explain that kind of empirical regularity. So now we have to a little bit massage the data to get the more appropriate findings. So how to do this one? We do this one in the third and the fourth column. So here, instead of using Gini, we use predicted Gini. So here Gini is the functions of income and income squared. And we found the closest type of relationship. So the closest type of relationship is embedded in this kind of variable. And then what you have here? You have positive and significant, and look at the size. How many times bigger than the initial one? The size is becoming bigger and becoming highly significant. So we check because here we check the predicted Gini, but we can't include here income, because we have included income in the first regressions. So to check the relationship between income and violence, we do a separate regressions by excluding inequality, but concentrating on the link between violence and income. Then we found the inverted EU relationship between income and violence. So this one explain this one, yeah? And this one explains this one after taking into account this one. So I hope I've explained in a very simple way how integrated are those three diagrams. So we find the same result in ethnic violence, but we check also the effect of horizontal inequality on ethnic violence. And of course, for ethnic violence, horizontal inequality is more important. But surprisingly, the similar type of relationship is also there. So there is a similarities of the effects of vertical inequality on routine violence and the effect of vertical inequality on ethnic violence. How to explain this one? One way to explain that one is, the nature of ethnic violence after 2005 is closer to the characteristics of routine violence. So, what is that? The nature of ethnic violence after 2005 is more sporadic and less concentrated in terms of regions, and which is very different from the nature of ethnic violence during the democratic transitions. Yeah? So the characteristic of routine violence that is supposed to be episodic in nature, after 2005 is becoming more routine. That's one explanation that I can think of. And then what about violent crime? Exactly the same results. This is because if you think of violent crime, if you think of routine violence, so you'll see a kind of close resemblance between those two kinds of variables that can be used as to proxy instability in the society. Okay, we did kind of several steps to check the robustness of the results. So we used the usual determinant of violent conflict using the opportunity hypothesis, and we control for the province and time-fixed attacks. And also we tried to use instead of incidence of violence, we used the death measures of violence, and the results are robust. To conclude, it is very important to differentiate the type of inequality and the type of violent conflict. This is important, very critical. And the contributions of this study is to see the relationship between the previously ignored type of inequality in the context of violent conflict. Because in the literature, the concentration of inequality, concern about inequality is about the horizontal one. So now we have contributed to the literature that vertical inequality is also important, but not to the large-scale, deadly kind of sportive violence, but on the routine violence. So, of course, this is kind of the implications. Of course, when we see the situation in Indonesia that inequality is high and rising, this is something that we need to worry about, and something must be done about this. I'll stop here. Thank you.
So I invite Athia Yumna to deliver her presentation. Please. 35 minutes.
Thank you, Bima. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Good morning, Bapak-bapak, Ibu-ibu sekalian. Today I will present our paper. This is actually a joint paper with other researchers at SMERU Research Institute. We have Asep and also two other researchers in the floor. So if I'm in the questions session, I'm a bit, I can, press the how friends stumble. So our presentation today is estimating the impact of inequality on growth and unemployment in Indonesia. As Mas Zulfan said, that we have two papers in this inequality impact. First on stability, and the second one is on prosperity. So this my presentation is on the nexus of inequality with prosperity. This is my outline of the presentation. I will explain briefly the introduction and then also theoretical framework of the nexus of inequality and prosperity, particularly on growth and unemployment. And the third, I will turn to the measures of inequality that we provide in this paper. Next, the model and the data that we exploit in this paper, estimate and result, robustness test, some robustness test, and sensitivity analysis, and the last one is conclusion. Expenditure inequality in Indonesia. As Zulfan discussed before, that the expenditure inequality in Indonesia is rising, has been rising since the last decade. From 0.3, this is the experience that we haven't had before, before decentralization, let's say, 10 to 15 years ago. So from 0.3 in 1998 to 0.4142 in 2013, last year, the inequality rising in Indonesia. So this is becoming, a growing concern, not only in Indonesia, but also for the global trend. But why does this matter, the inequality? So if you look at the theory behind the inequality, expenditure inequality, or people say income or consumption inequality, is often related to the other forms of inequality. For example, inequality in access to education, health, and public services. But also, on the other hand, inequality may encourage the market to invest more, for example, in technological advances and human capital. So the inequality is necessary for accumulation for assets that in turns will be invested in these types of investment. So conclusion is rather unclear, actually. So there is no consensus from the previous studies on whether the impact of higher inequality is detrimental or not. This is what we try to provide evidence for the case of Indonesia in this paper. And beside of that reason, we also recognize the inequality. Zulfan also said about the vertical versus the horizontal inequality. Vertical inequality between groups, between individual or household, and inequality between groups, or horizontal inequality that pioneered by Francis Stewart and friends in Oxford. And also, we also recognize the other dimension of inequality. We should not, kind of ignore the other dimension of inequality. So we try to, kind of incorporate other dimension. It is the education inequality in this paper that also matters for various aspects of the economy. So the common understanding on different aspects of inequality and possible available policy option to address the issue are important in order to prevent possible adverse impact of inequality. So this study the main objective of this study is to investigate empirically the impact of different types of inequality, not only vertical but also horizontal, not only expenditure but also other dimension, which is we provide educational inequality on economic growth and employment. So specifically Indonesia, by employing a district level panel data set from rich panel data set from 2000 to 2012. Theoretical framework, I will explain briefly. So there are actually the relationship between inequality and development can be explained by two-way causal relationships. The first one is economic development affects inequality. Zulfan said about the Kuznets curve. So as the economic growth, inequality first will increase and then later will decrease. The idea is based on workers' movement from agriculture to industry. This is what Kuznets and also Barrow explored in their paper. And the second one is, how does inequality affect economic development? So there are several channels in the theory in which inequality may affect economic growth. So please note that our study, this study is focused on in this causal relationship, the second causal relationship in which how inequality does affect the economy, particularly on growth and unemployment. So this is, I show you the simple graph of channels of inequality to economic growth. First one, for example, inequality to saving rate. It's the sign for inequality to saving rate first is the positive one. So inequality will accommodate all marginal propensity of saving from the rich, and then it will. The theory says the increasing saving rates will increasing investment, and later will turn to increasing economic growth. The other theory says that, for example, the distribution, it is related to the political economy of the political economy, where inequality will, give a positive effect on redistribution, and then redistribution will have either negative or positive impact on economic growth. So from this graph, we should recognize very cautiously that it is indeed inequality has an impact, but what impact that inequality has is there is no consensus whether it is positive or negative. So previous study has shown various results of the relationship. For the theoretical framework on unemployment, actually we kind of find it difficult to find the theoretical framework of unemployment. We cite from ILO in 2011 that some major consequences of high and persistent unemployment are increasing social discontent and risk of social unrest, which are significantly motivated by income inequality, and also one evidence from South Africa, education inequality between races in South Africa can explain high levels of unemployment. Then, however, the theoretical framework of the impact of inequality on unemployment seems to be still unexplored and undeveloped compared to the relationship between inequality and growth, as I briefly explained before. And what measures of inequality that we have in this paper is, first one is the vertical inequality. We measure it with Gini coefficient. I think you probably know the Gini. It is, in principle, it is Gini measures the extent to which the distribution of income or consumption expenditure among individuals or households within the economy deviates from perfectly equal distribution. And also, besides vertical inequality, we also measure the horizontal inequality, which are, we measure here two measurements, which are group Gini, and then the second one is weighted group coefficient of variation. So difference between vertical and horizontal. Vertical is between individual or household. Horizontal is between groups. We measure groups here are ethnicity and religious groups. About data and variables, this study used a district level, rich district level manual data set from the period 2000 and 2012 from various sources, SUSNAS, census, some covariance also comes from PODES, and we also have main variables of district GRDP. This is the details of the data and variables. We have two main dependent variables, which are economic growth and unemployment, and independence. Some main independent variables, which are vertical inequalities, horizontal, and also we provide in this data set about fractionalization based on ethnicity and also based on religion. Also heterogeneity. So it's calculate the heterogeneity within the district based on religion and ethnic. The control variables in each model. There are two models in this paper, growth and unemployment model. So this is the details of each model with the control variable. There are economic development variables, and also we control also for population and geography related variables. The model itself, we exploit the ordinary least square initial. So the right hand side is the initial, and y is the subsequent growth and subsequent unemployment here, with the control variables, initial control variables, and also dummy, island dummy, and the same with in the unemployment. Turns to the estimation results. First one, the inequality and growth nexus. We have the main results of, so the specification in this main model is we split the data between 2000 to 2012 becoming 2. So the initial inequality is, we calculate average 2000-2005, on subsequent growth on 2006-2011. The main objective of this, what you call, the main objective of this specification is to mitigate the effect of transitory shock. It is a contemporaneous shock, and also a measurement error between data, in the data. 10 minutes. So the main result is that we have nonlinear relationship between initial expenditure Gini and subsequent growth here. The peak of the, I will show the graph later. And the second one, for the education Gini, we find no significant relationship between Gini, between inequality, education inequality, and subsequent growth. So this is the graph. It will show more clear about so the dots are representative of the districts in Indonesia. We can see here that most of the majority of the districts still on this is the peak, about 0.3. So the majority of the districts still in the left-hand side of the curve. But some, we should be note that some districts are already past the peak. We can see, if we zoom the curve, we can see some districts or some kabupaten kota that already passed the peak here. Most of it is in Jakarta. So it means that the districts are already past the higher inequality, and the relationship between this higher inequality impacted on reducing growth. So we also try to, in one of our reference, Benjamin Branning Gill's one paper that we have in our reference. So we try to replicate what was done in Benjamin Branning Gill's, in which we run models using different beginning and end point, point and end point of the growth. So for the Gini, we only have significant coefficient of Gini in the longer terms period. So if we use the Gini 2006, 2008 in the beginning point, and then it will have inverted U-shape relationship with the subsequent growth on 2009, 2011. The same if we exploit the education Gini, we only find the significant here, the linear relationship between education Gini in 2000-2002 has a positive impact on endpoint growth, subsequent growth 2003-2005. But also we also find the significant coefficient here. Okay. Now turns to the horizontal inequalities related to subsequent growth. We find interesting results in this regression. So we exploit these are ethnicity, horizontal inequality variable based on ethnicity and religion. So these are the main, the explanatory variable, the dependent variable, and these, the explanatory variable, and these are the impact on growth. So for the ethnicity, we find that the fractionalization based on ethnicity and also the heterogeneity is increasing subsequent growth both in longer term and short term. Here, 0.1 in the longer, and the short term 0.1 as well. And here, with the less magnitude of impact of heterogeneity, ethnic heterogeneity. It's a bit different with we find a bit different result in the religious based horizontal inequality, where we find there is no impact on fractionalization, but positive impact on heterogeneity based on religion. See, we will explore it later. And also, we try to do some robustness check on the regression estimation because of two reasons. Yeah, first one is because the period of 2000-2002 was an early recovery period after the Asian financial crisis, we know that, where the level inequality of that time was relatively low. Then the robustness check will ensure our results are not driven by the first couple of recovery years, as well as by checking whether we get the same result if we use 2003 data as our first start. So, and the second one, we should treat why we do this robustness, time robustness check, because we should treat very cautiously our variables which are generated from Susenas it is acknowledgeable that there are some adjustment and changes in the sustenance break in 2011. So these robustness checks will reveal whether the changes in robustness, the changes in sustenance affect our result or not. And then the results, we come up with this result. It's quite robust because it still, we still have the same coefficient and this, the same sign, inverted U-shape, the curve, and it's significant for Gini to growth. And here, with the initial inequality, if we exclude 2000 to 2002 data, we still also have the significant coefficient here, and still inverted U-shape. And then the second robustness check is we utilize the panel nature of the data of the district and have alternate estimation methods using district, province, island, using district, province, island fixed method, and random effects. So to smooth the data, we first calculate 3-year average of all variables. So then we have here initial inequality average 2 years from 2000 to 2012, and then also by splitting island, province, and district for fixed and random effect, we also smooth the growth average 2 years. And then to deal with the endogeneity problem, we estimate the model using lag-dependent variables. Finally, we estimated separate regression to test whether the impacts are different between district, province, and islands. So for expenditure Gini, the only significant coefficient of lag consumption Gini ratio are within the island and province. Island and province random effect in random effects, but we also test this fixed and random effects model with the Hausman test. It shows that overall this results indicates that my models are preferred to the alternative, the fixed and random effects model. Second one, inequality and employment. I should run, I think. Okay. Our main result is we split the data into two time periods between initial inequality and subsequent unemployment, 2000, 2005 to 2000, 2006 here. We find interesting result for education Gini. The coefficient is significant and is U-shaped. The curve is U-shaped. We can also here show that the graph show that the majority of the districts are in the right-hand side. And then if we zoom the curve, it will show which district are in the left or in the right-hand side. We also split beginning period and endpoint period. Again, the interesting results are in the education Gini here. So the beginning period of education Gini 2000-2002 have an impact on 2006-2008 subsequent unemployment, and also 2009-2011 subsequent unemployment. Horizontal inequalities. Again, we find interesting result in here. The group Gini based on ethnicity has an impact on subsequent unemployment with the inverted U-shape, and for the horizontal inequality based on religion, it shows the fractionalization and has nonlinear relationship with the subsequent unemployment. Robustness check, we do the same specification with the growth model. So we find U-shaped relationship between education Gini on subsequent unemployment, and also, but here we find significant, inverted U-shaped Gini, expenditure Gini, initial expenditure Gini, to subsequent employment 2007-2010. Time to conclude our results. So the first one, this study is important at least in two ways. Because it provides evidence of the impact of inequality in Indonesia. And then the second one, the most important one, I think, is because the Indonesian context provides an opportunity to address some empirical issues that plug previous studies, which are more based on cross-sectional data. So, and the second conclusion is that different measures of inequality associated with various outcomes differently. We see that the findings indicate expenditure inequality affects more on subsequent growth. Meanwhile, the education inequality adversely affects subsequent unemployment. And also, similar to horizontal inequality across ethnic groups, are also found to have nonlinear embedded U-shape with growth, and across all religion groups have negative linear relationship with unemployment. However, there is a tendency for the relationship between inequality and the outcome variables to be nonlinear and changing over time. So therefore, we should treat this issue of inequality very cautiously, and relate to the policy option. We should be ready with anticipated policy response. That is our last conclusion. Our last conclusion. I think I should note our limitation in this paper. Yes, we find that the inequalities have an impact, but we haven't had any answer about why and how. And then this study has also diagnostic results, but not prescription, but not the medicine on how and where to deal with the inequality. I think I should end my presentation here. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Athia. And now it's my pleasure to invite Pak Asep to deliver his presentation. Silakan Pak Asep.
Thank you, Bima. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Salam sejahtera, selamat pagi, good morning everyone. The paper that I'm going to present today is a joint paper with Arman Sin and Radhi Negara. I don't know if you notice or not, but my name always came up as the last author in the three papers, indicating that maybe I just play a minimal role in the papers, but because of my luck, today Arman is in the US and Radhi is in Kalimantan, so I have to present this paper. The outline for my presentation is like this, so I will start with the motivation first, then look more deeply into the background and related studies on this issue. Then from that, we will try to develop some conceptual framework. Then you have an idea how we can test the relationship of the three variables, and I will discuss a little bit about the data. Then from that, I will outlay the empirical strategy and discuss the result with you. We also did some heterogeneity analysis in the end, and we ended the conclusion. So the motivation for this study basically is that, okay, we now know the impact of inequality on growth, on unemployment, on violence and crime. last 15 years in Indonesia, social protection is a big thing, yeah, because after the end of the crisis in 1998. And if we think about one of the main issues in the implementation of the social protection programs is the targeting. Because my study with Pak Sudarno, for example, find that social protection programs are effective only if it is targeted correctly. Yeah. Effective in the sense that it will increase consumptions of the poor and reduce poverty reductions. Inequality comes into the targeting equation because with higher inequality, actually, it is easier to differentiate between the non-poor and the poor. Because one of the reasons, for example, when we go to the field and asking people in the villages, why this program is not targeted sharply to the poor, because they said that here we are basically similar. Yeah. What you call as the poor and the non-poor, in reality, it's not too different in the daily lives. So in an equal society, it's actually quite difficult to differentiate the non-poor and the poor. When inequality increasing, it becomes more obvious who are the non-poor and who are the poor. And a study by Cody, Gross, and Hodinot, which review more than basically hundreds of social protection programs in the world, they basically find that indeed in the cross-country study analysis, they find that targeting performance is better in countries with more unequal countries, meaning higher inequality. Yeah. So okay, we think, well, that's clear. Yeah. But when we look deeper into the literature, it turns out the relationships between inequality and targeting is not that linear. Yeah. Because then elite captures comes into play. Yeah. The idea is that at the local level, when inequality is higher, and especially when the poor is powerless, then elite culture becomes very strong. Then elite culture can strongly distort targeting. So now it's become more messy. Yeah. So we think, well, this is a good idea for research. So we will look at the relationship between the three variables: inequality, elite culture, and targeting, and we apply to the Indonesian context. And we choose the two largest social protection programs, which are Raskin and BLT. And in this case, we look at the situations in 2008-2009. We used the 2009 Susnas. Fortunately, BLT was also run in 2008-2009. So we have we think it's an ideal data to test for this. That's the motivations. The background about the program first, about Raskin. Why we try to contrast between Raskin and BLT. Raskin basically is basically has decentralized targeting mechanisms. In this program, Bulog, at the time, which was the implementing agency, basically calculates the number of the eligible recipient in each village and allocate rice to the villages based on this number, and distribute the rice to the villages. After the rice comes to the villages, it is the responsibility of the local official, Kepala Desa and his apparatus to distribute the rice basically. So it is a decentralized targeting, and we have found from many studies which have been done on Raskin that the result of this, the distribution of Raskin, is more equal distribution. Basically, the targeting is not very good in Raskin. BLT, on the other hand, is using more centralized targeting method, it distributes cash to the poor, and the cash is distributed via the local post office. And it has the local official have very limited power on affecting the BLT distribution, except during the data collections period in the PSE 05, which is actually used in both Raskin and BLT. So this is the data that it used in both programs in 2008-2009, yeah, which is the PSE 05, Household Socioeconomic Survey 2005. This is the data used for the targeting of both programs. The steps in this data collection, in the first step, the enumerators from the BPS collects data from various sources, basically from the BKKBN, from property census and everything, and they have a preliminary list of the poor within each village. Then the enumerator go to the villages and consult the list with the local area unit, the head of local SLS, for usually it's an RT or an RW. Then from that, they have some modification to the list. And the enumerator is supposed to visit all the poor people on the list to verify. Yeah, because there is a form that needs to be filled. And based on that form, they calculate the score for each poor people, and then BPS determine who are the poor which are eligible to receive this. But in practice, this is ideal, yeah? But in practice, enumerator usually skip the steps in analyzing and visiting all poor households. They think they know the characteristics of the poor, they just fill in the form. So, but the data that's used and used in both Raskin and BLT. So basically they come from the same database, yeah? But the actual implementation become quite different. A little bit about decentralized targeting. So if we look at the literature, it seems that decentralized targeting is considered as the most efficient and effective method for targeting. The reason is because local officials are more accountable than the central government. For example, Alderman from the World Bank argued about this. And also, on the study by Cody, Gross, and Hodilon, they find that conditional on income level, targeting performance is better in countries with accountable government. So this matches with the Alderman hypothesis. But there is a downside to decentralized targeting. And the major downside is that the risk by capture by the elites. Yeah. For example, Galasso and Ravalion find in India, in villages where there is a high land inequality, this inequality in land ownership actually also reflects inequality in power. So the poor become powerless, and then this elite captures happen in these villages. In other cases, Sayers and Derhong, for example, found that elite capture could also happen because of special relationships between some of the poor and non-poor people with the local elites, which also could distort targeting. And interestingly, Arojo found that it's not only land equality, but income equality also positively related with risk capture. But a study by Chikako Yamauchi found that it didn't happen in Indonesia during the New Order era. She did the study on the IDP program, the Impres Desa Tertinggal program at the time. She said there was no elite capture in Indonesia. On the targeting performance in Indonesia, this is basically for the post-reform era, after 98, 99, so the GPS to now era. For example, we find that targeting performance is usually inadequate. Yeah? A study by the Alton, for example, find that the Raskin program suffers leakage up to 18%, and 80% of this leakage comes from the mistargeting. A more recent study by Vivi Alitas and her friends at the World Bank found that elite captures in Indonesia actually happens during the actual distribution phase of the benefits. So based on this literature, we try to understand the relationship between inequality, elite captures, and targeting. First, elite captures occurs when local officials abuse their power to secure their own interest. Basically, and their main own interest is to get elected, basically. And the existence of elite capture could inhibit decentralized targeting from delivering the desired outcomes, although theoretically it's the best targeting method. And elite capture is positively associated with inequality level, especially when the local poor are powerless or voiceless also. And inequality actually could give institutional power to the elites in affecting the public programs to the most favored. So how we can explain the possible mechanisms of how the relationship between inequality and elite capture could have consequences on targeting performance? First, higher inequality makes distinction between the poor and non-poor more obvious. Okay, so this is clear. But unfortunately, at the same time, this may prompt local officials from abusing their power because they now know who are the poor, who are the non-poor, and they can target their interests accordingly. An incumbent leader who are in power now actually sees the poor as a pool of potential voters. So inequality can lead to a better targeting performance because if there is an opportunity, the incumbent will try to make sure that the majority of all of the poor get benefits from the program. But if he did that without sacrificing his supporters who are non-poor, then it becomes less clear-cut. And I think that's what we find in our study. So we use, in this study, our unit of observation is a district level, kabupaten kota level. And we use two sources of data, it's Susenas and PODES from 2009, PODES is 2008, that's the latest. The Susenas is for the household socioeconomic variables, and actually Susenas is better than PSA 05 in identifying the beneficiaries because they have consumption data, while PSA only use proxy. For the PODES, we use it to for the village variables, but both Susenas and village levels then aggregated at the district level. And the final database in our analysis, we have 465 districts with non-missing variables. And this is the data that we use in the analysis. Some descriptive analysis, just to show you that we have 4 outcome variables with inclusion error of BLT, inclusion error of Raskin, exclusion error of BLT, and exclusion error of Raskin. If you look at the number, actually the error is quite high. Inclusion error in BLT, for example, is about 50%, in Raskin is about 55%. The exclusion error of BLT is 53%, and for Raskin is 35%. Inclusion error is the proportions of the poor, the proportion of the non-poor who receive the benefit, this inclusion error. The exclusion error is the proportion of the poor who did not receive the benefit. These are our main independent variables, the Gini ratio, and these are the others, district level variable as the control variable. So on average, the Kabupaten Kota has about 0.29 Gini ratio, about 49% of the household receives Raskin and 32% receive BLT. The other are just control variables. So to do the analysis, we try to mimic how the government target the recipients of both BLT and Raskin, using the PAC-05. So basically, we have to standardize per capita expenditure because the value of rupiah across region actually is different. By standardizing, we try to make the value the same, basically. So we just define the nominal per capita expenditure with the ratio of property line in Jakarta with the respective district. That's basically what we did. And after we calculate this standardized per capita expenditure, we rank all households in Indonesia from the poorest to the richest. And we mimic the government program by cutting the bottom 19.1 million household as the eligible household to receive the benefits of both programs, because this is the number that is used by the government. And if we look at this diagram on the left hand side here, if the targeting is 100% correct, the figure will be like this. So the poorest 40% will receive the benefit, and the richest 60% will receive nothing. This is basically the targeting, the ideal targeting, or what's supposed to happen when the poorest 30% of household receives the benefit. But the reality is quite different. This is the actual distribution of benefits. This is for BLT, and the red one is for Raskin. We see that along this household decile, there are groups of households which receive both programs. Even at the top 10%, the richest 10% of population, there are some who still receive the benefits. So when we say that the targeting is inadequate, this is the evidence. Okay. So we now try to calculate the impact of Gini ratio here on targeting outcomes. And remember, I have 4 outcomes here, which is the inclusion errors of BLT and Raskin and exclusion errors of BLT and Raskin, controlled by other variables that might affect performance at the district level. And the result is like this. If you look at the inclusion error, in both BLT and Raskin, the coefficients are not significant. On the other hand, for exclusion error, the coefficients are negative and significant. What this means? When it is become more obvious the difference between the non-poor and the poor, the local leaders did not try to reduce the non-poor who received the benefit, but they do try to add more poor people to receive the benefit. This is actually an indirect evidence of elite capture, because it shows that the local leader tried to lower the proportion of eligible households not receiving BLT of Raskin, but at the same time tried to keep some of the non-eligible households as the beneficiaries. This is an indication of elite capture. If you look at the benefit, the coefficients for BLT is minus 0.55, while for Raskin is minus 0.5, which implies that an indication of higher elite capture in Raskin in BLT. because they can only add smaller number of poor people who originally don't receive raskin to receive raskin. While for BLT they can add more people, indicating that elite culture is higher in raskin distribution than in BLT distribution. Does it make sense that raskin has higher elite culture than BLT? We think so. I think that there are at least two reasons for this. First, the distribution method, the targeting method, shows that indeed that the local officials have more power in influencing the targeting of raskin than in BLT. Secondly, the monetary value of the benefit itself is much higher in BLT than in raskin. So the beneficiaries themselves have more incentive to make sure that the targeting is more correct in BLT than in raskin. So, but overall, this finding shows that we found that indirect evidence of elite culture in the distribution in both programs, although in raskin is higher. I think that's basically the findings of our studies. Then we do some heterogeneity analysis to see whether this holds in many contexts or not. First, we divide the districts into two groups. One is the higher inequality district, and the other one is the low inequality districts. We use the median as the cutting point. If we look at the result, it's basically the same qualitatively, not significant for inclusion error in the high inequality district, and negative and significant exclusion error, and with much higher coefficient and higher for BLT than raskin. This strengthened our conclusion from the main result. In the low inequality district also the same, not significant for inclusion error, but only significant for BLT for exclusion error. So in low inequality districts, the elite catcher in raskin is actually stronger. Yeah? They couldn't even add more poor people to receive the benefit of raskin. Secondly, we divide the districts by the level of educational attainment. We look at the proportions of population within the district which have senior higher education or more, yeah? And split the district by the median, so high education district and low education district basically. And here we find also the same, yeah, basically. Not significant for inclusion error and significant for exclusion error, but now interestingly that raskin has higher coefficients than BLT in the highly educated districts. So when people are more educated, they will try to assert their rights to get the benefit. Yeah? Even in raskin, they can get higher coefficients here. But for the low educated district, there is no significant coefficient for exclusion error, meaning the poor didn't get anything, but actually it increases inclusion error for raskin. In fact, more non-poor getting more raskin benefit in the low educated district. If we divide the districts into urban and rural, it becomes more interesting. Yeah. For raskin, the coefficient for both inclusion error and exclusion errors are not significant, but for BLT, it's both significant. So actually in urban areas, the elite catcher is smaller than in rural areas. So rural area has a stronger elite catcher. They even didn't change the distributions. Yeah, even when the difference between the poor and non-poor become clear. Yeah, that's the conclusion from this. So in rural areas, only the exclusion error for final one, we try to do a sensitivity analysis of the measure of inequality that we use. So far we have used Gini ratio, but in this one we use a new, but not new. It's a measure of inequality which is becoming more popular now because it's easier to interpret. It's the so-called Palma ratio. Palma ratio is basically the ratio of income or expenditure, in this case expenditure, between the top 10%, top richest 10%, and the bottom 40% of the population. Fortunately, the results basically the same with the main result. No significant effects on inclusion error, and significant effect negative for exclusion error, and higher in delta in rasking. So this confirms our findings from using Gini ratio. So to conclude, again, our study finds that higher inequality reduces exclusion error, but has no impact on inclusion error. And BLT has higher inequality and elasticity of inclusion error, which is 0.55, while rasking is only 0.5. And these two are indirect evidence of the existence of elite captures in social protection programs in Indonesia. And in this case, we found that the elite capture is bigger in rasking than in BLT. So even though theoretically decentralized targeting should deliver the best outcome, in the Indonesian case we find it's the other way around. Because of the existence of elite capture, decentralized targeting does not generate the best results in terms of benefit distribution in social protection program. What are the implications of our findings? I think basically there are two. If you want to have a better targeting performance outcome, it needs at least two efforts. One is we need a special effort to reduce inclusion error. I think that has been very prevalent. Yeah? The proportion of the non-poor who are not eligible, who actually receive the benefit. We should try to reduce this. And secondly, we need stricter supervisions in more equal communities. Yeah? When inequality is low, actually it requires higher effort in targeting. That's end my presentation. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Pak Asep, for the presentation. And this presentation is like, to me actually, especially like, give us a new and a broader insight about inequality. Because in common sense, that when someone says about inequality, then we usually think about the economic inequality. About the rich and the poor, and also about the growth or other economic measurement of inequality. However, when we try to look deeper about inequality, and then we can find various forms and types of inequality that might affect our life differently, in different way, in different things. For example, like Mas Zulfan and Athia show us that beside the vertical inequality, there are also like horizontal inequality that may affect many other things in our daily life, not only from the point of view of economics aspect, but also from the social aspect. And we need to think about how we can handle this problem of inequality, because it is quite difficult to develop mechanism to reduce, to lessen the negative effect of inequality, as Pak Asep shows in his presentation, that other aspect, like for example the elite captures, makes the program or the interventions developed by the government become less effective as when there is no aspect related to the inequality. So I think this seminar, these presentations invite us to rethink about our standing of inequality, about how we try to identify actually what kind of inequality that we have to handle, and then how we can develop policies in order to lessen the impact, negative impacts on our wealth, and also for in other things, in other social aspects. And so now I would like to open the discussion session, and I will give opportunity to 3 people first to raise questions or comments on the presentations. And please mention your name and also your institution before you say about your question, please. And first, and second, and okay. Sorry, will be the first.
Zulfan, Asep, Athia, thank you very much for sharing. You bring new insight, and I also learned from this. I'm Kajian Pembangunan from University of Indonesia. I have some bit of questions and comments to Zulfan and Asep. Zulfan, I think the database is interesting, and maybe you could comment on the possibility of adding, say, controlling for extractive activities, mining or plantation, forestry. Because the 12 hotspot provinces, they are to a large extent related to these activities, and that might, I don't know, might explain these non-periodic and somehow sporadic conflicts. For Pak Asep, in one of the conceptual framework, it said, suggested that intelligence possibly associated with inequality level, especially when local poor are powerless. When I listened to this framing, suddenly, I think participation will be one of the recommendations. But if I'm not mistaken, the study by Ben Alton also shows that I think Ben seems to suggest that it's supposed to be more centralized instead of participation, because it tends to increase the corruption. Because it's a bit politically incorrect, because we see something better in having participation, but in terms of corruption, it is going the other way around. So maybe you could comment on that. But the second one to accept is I don't know how to say it, but I think it's like a dilemma of asking if elite can pick and decide on who will be the beneficiaries. But then Raskin is Raskin, and there's a certain quality of the brass here. So we might pick poor people which is not so poor, and we provide them with a certain level of the brass, of rice, but they prefer something else. They prefer a better brass. So they might oppose the brass that we propose. Do you see this? Or maybe it's not captured, or maybe you could comment on it, because I just finished a survey on 2,000 households in the north and east Jakarta, and they seem to say if the rice is not so good, then we don't take it, although they are chosen by local rulers. Appreciate very much if you could also share the idea for them. Thank you.
And for the second question is for Pak with the
Morning, my name is Iksan.
I'm sorry, Pak, with Pak Executive dulu. Sorry.
Thank you. My name is Ahmed Harun, retired from GIZ Social Protection Program. My first question to Ibu Athia. Since you mentioned the initial education, have you ever mentioned in your study about the supply side readiness? Not only the inequality based on the people affordability, but if supply side is not ready for initial education, and then this will be the most important issues for policy to be addressed by government. And to Pak Asep, if we look at the exclusion error of the BLT, I don't know if you have already addressed in your study about the conditional criteria. So the poor people is already targeted beneficiaries, but to get the benefit, they cannot fulfill the conditional criteria that caused by the other sector. For instance, they will get the cash transfer if they fulfill some health services for antenatal care, immunization, and so on. But if the supply side of the health services is not there, this is not their fault. So I just want to remind that we have to be neutral, because helicopters, it's like very sensitive. We have to clearly exclude all technical aspects. Thank you.
Okay, for the third question is for Pak.
Terima kasih Pak Asep. My name is Iksan. Just three straight questions. The first one is actually, I tried to basically reconciling the story of like the two papers and the story on Indonesia recent experience. First you say that targeting is good, but targeting from your paper seems to be one. First, correlate with higher inequality. Second, better targeting seems to one. Second, correlate with negative growth. Third, better targeting seems to correlate with the number of poor being declining over time since 2011, 2012. So I don't understand how the stories actually fit in. I mean, like with your story here, if you put like 2005 to 2012, yeah. You need better targeting. But if you conflict this argument with the actual recent data of Indonesia, particularly since 2009 to 2012, there's some missing link here. Why this has happened? Why your argument says that better targeting is actually good? Back to the paper. That's my first comment. Yeah? My first general comment. The second one, I mean, like all these papers, good, pretty much like in terms of the models and the empirical theory that used, but it fails to explain one thing, very important one thing. What is actually the main cause of higher inequality in Indonesia? It doesn't have any of this paper explanations of what actually the actual cause of inequality in Indonesia. There's several theories, and I think it's quite interesting. As to which hypothesis is actually the main argument that can be used in Indonesia. The third one is about this, the paper from Pak Tadjoeddin as well as Ibu Athia Yumna is quite interesting. But what Pak Tadjoeddin, I'm actually just wondering why you put the data from 2005 to 2012, even though I mean, like there were perhaps like a very interesting period between 1999 and 2004, 2003. which you can see there's a lot of conflict, not only normal conflict, but abnormal conflict. And when you skip these data periodizations, or you include these data periodizations, your conclusion may be different, totally different from if you're using kind of 2005 to 2012, the story might be different if you're using 1999 to 2012. I'm just wondering why. I mean, like, this is such an important point, I think, in Indonesia, but then you cut it off totally. And for the Asep and Asep Suryahadi, for the third, this is I'm just you maybe exclude the possibility of the benevolent elite in Indonesia. So this paper of this decapturing by elite, it's presumed that elite doing the bad things by, I mean, like this capturing. I think from your, I think there's a several SMERU paper as well, which says that community distribution, not per se, is bad at all. That's my questions. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Pak Isan. And now I will let Mas Zulfan, Athia, and Asep to respond the
Okay, thank you for those questions. The first one is from Pak Soni. Yes, it will be very interesting to entertain the idea of the effect of extractive industry. But let's go back to the basic. The study is about scrutinizing the relationship between inequality and violent conflict as the inverse indicator of social stability. This is already a specified objective, and the literature is quite ambiguous in terms of the empirical evidence. So, if we want to entertain that idea, that will be too much in the current study. That can be a separate project, if you like. But if we go back to the period of during the democratic transitions, actually, I already have another study linking the oil-rich, oil gas-rich provinces in Indonesia, and linking that one with the secessionist conflict, and linking that one with the nature of regional inequality in Indonesia before the democratic transitions. So I've done that one in different papers, but not in this one. Of course, to entertain the idea of extractive industry, linking that one with routine violence is something that can be done. So I think this will be another idea for the next project for me. I mean, since I've been doing research on conflict for the last couple of years. So, if you ask me to comment on that one, how that kind of relationship will play, if that one will be considered, I think one thing that we need to be clear here, we need to develop the framework first. Are we going to explain to see the relationship between extractive industry or the extractive nature of the economy and violence? Or we want to see the triangular relationship between violence, inequality, or extractive industry? So that could be an interesting project. And but what I can see is we have to start with the framework first, okay, and then we find what kind of possible empirical strategy to support that kind of hypothesis. For me, this is an amazing idea to move forward for the next project. So I'll stop commenting on that one. On the second one, why not the main period of unstable Indonesia during the democratic transitions? This is actually a kind of continuation of this project is a continuation of my previous studies on conflict in Indonesia. my book on collective violence in Indonesia has just been published a few months ago by Palgrave, explaining collective violence in contemporary Indonesia, especially examining the 4 types of violence during the democratic transition. So the diagram that I showed you, the 3 diagram linking income and inequality, and then violence and income, and then violence and inequality, that kind of relationship has been found in the context of Java during the democratic transitions, in the context of routine violence. Now what we did here, to check that kind of findings in the context of post-democratic transitions and post-decentralization in Indonesia, in the previously high conflict regions. Before, we only have a very good data for routine violence only in Java, because we can see that during the democratic transition, we can see where was the secessionist violence, where were the ethnic violence, and where routine violence. So the pattern was, we know where separatist violence were, and we know where ethnic violence, and the most interesting finding about the category of collective violence during the democratic transitions was routine violence was predominantly in Java. But now what we can see is routine violence is becoming the norm of the whole Indonesia. We are away from the ethnic violence, we are away from routine secessionist violence, largely speaking, but now we are dealing with the more universal trend of routine violence, not only in Java, but also in the previously high conflict means referring to the episodic kinds of violence. So this is a kind of shifting pattern. So when we can see the shifting pattern, so we need to cut. So I can argue for the argument for cutting that one. So the idea of 2005. So look what happened in 2005. More or less, the basic feature of decentralization in Indonesia has been achieved. The climax of decentralization in Indonesia is political decentralization through direct local elections of executives. So this adds to the importance of 2005. So after all the dust of the turbulent period of decentralization reform and democratic transitions has passed, and now we see the different pattern of collective violence. Now let's scrutinize that one. Of course, we can go back. But going back to the period before 2005, that will give different data treatment. And so the reasons can be both. One is technical, and the second one is conceptual. So that's my comment.
Thank you. I have one question from Harman, I think, on why we choose initial education inequality rather than supply side readiness of education. I think this is interesting comments as well as interesting insight for our maybe further research, because we try in this paper, in this study, we try to focus on initial inequality, either in income, expenditure inequality, and education, but we also control this inequality with the impact of inequality on growth, controlling for other variables based on population or economic development, and as well as some village population, village and geographical related variables. But for supply side readiness variables, particularly on education, we haven't had any chance to explore it in this paper. So I cannot answer your question whether this supply side readiness is more important than initial education inequality. But yeah, we have counter variables for mean years of schooling in the district levels. It shows a significant coefficient to the subsequent growth. So yes, education it's important for growth. I think that's all my comments for your question. Thank you.
Thank you for all the very good questions. The first one from Pak Sony on participation. Thank you. That's for the very insightful suggestions. Yeah. We are reluctant to put as recommendations to improve participation. Yeah. Why? Because one, empirically, we found in our other studies, for example, looking at the PNPM, which is a program which tries to improve participations at the village level, we found that PNPM can only improve participation within the program itself. Yeah. It fails to diffuse participations into the broader village life. There is no improvement in terms of participation at the village decision making, for example. Even though in the village there is a good participation mechanism of the PNPM program. And that's, we think, because participation is actually an endogenous variable. Participation doesn't come up exogenously from outside. People can participate only when they are more or less on equal basis. Yeah. So when the inequality is already high in the beginning, we find it might be too difficult to improve participations by way of just introducing the concepts without actually improving the economic balance within the communities. I think that's our reason. But thanks for the suggestions. We will think more about it, whether there are other examples where participation can be improved without improving inequality itself first. Secondly, your point about the quality of rice is quite valid. Yeah. But what we found that not hinders for the non-poor to receive rice from Raskin because of two reasons. One, they can use the rice for other purposes. For example, to feed animals. Yeah. To feed, if they have chicken or if they have other animals, they keep the low quality Raskin rice to the animal. Secondly, and what is more prevalent now is that the Raskin rice actually is resold to the traders who will collect all the Raskin rice, and the traders will later resell the rice to the Bulog. So it's become like a circular path between Bulog, the community, traders, Bulog, community, traders, like that. And the rice is circling behind this, among these agents. And over time, the quality of the rice become worse and worse. I think it will stop when the rice completely become black in color or something like that. For Pak Harun, thank you for the questions, Pak. But in BLT, they don't have conditions, yeah. Because BLT is a unconditional cash transfer. They have conditions in the PKH program, the conditional cash transfer. But I think in our studies, even in PKH, actually the conditions don't really matter to the receipt of the benefits because basically just formality. They have the card, you have to take whether you go to the Posyandu or not, or something like that. But even if you don't, you still get the money. I think that the mechanism has to be improved in order for your supply side constraint to matter to this. For Pak Isan Mojo, on your first comment, what I was trying to say is not that targeting is completely missed in Indonesia. If we look at these two diagrams between what's supposed to happen and what actual to happen, we see that there are still some targeting. Our point is that it can be better, or it should be better. It should not be as rather flat like that, but it should be steeper like this. I think this is our point. So, no wonder we still have poverty reductions from social protection program, even though the targeting is not perfect. It still has some targeting, but it can be better, I think. Your second point about the cost of increasing inequality, you are exactly right. We didn't deal with that question. Why? Because we know that there are people who are studying that. In fact, there is an international organization who is now having a very large project trying to exactly answer this question. What is the reason behind increasing inequality in Indonesia? They have done the study for maybe almost 2 years, but I haven't seen any public seminar on the results. So we are still waiting also for them. We didn't want to deal with that question because we don't want to duplicate the work from others. Your third point, very interesting about the benevolent elite. I think if we want to interpret our findings in this concept, where we see that when inequality is higher, so the difference between the poor and the poor become clearer, the elite do try to accept more poor people into the program, that we can say benevolent. But they didn't kick out the non-poor who already received the benefit. So in this case, they are not benevolent. So maybe we can say that in Indonesia, the elite is half benevolent. Thank you. I think that's my answer.
Okay, thank you very much, Pak Asep. And so we still have like about 20 minutes for this session. So I will open for like 3 more questions. And 1, 2, and okay, 3. Okay, so please mention your name and your institution.
Thank you very much. First, I'd like to thank the panel for a very enlightening set of presentations and very robust analyses. They were very impressive. My first question, I think, is for Athia, but I think others may comment on it as well. I wonder if horizontal, I think you're measuring horizontal inequality. I wonder if how we might look at the concept of relative deprivation instead of measure education differences, ethnic groups. Zulfan also mentioned that it appears that ethnic-based and religious-based inequality, or at least perceived inequality or violence associated with it, seems to be decreasing in Indonesia, which suggests that horizontal inequality is sort of being redefined now. It's no longer based on those things. I wonder if we could use a different measure again. People's perception of power, politics, opportunities, they're being differentiated horizontally now based on those issues instead of on ethnicity and education and things of that nature. I wondered if you might comment on that. For Zulfan, I think it's kind of related. I'm curious to hear your perspectives on why wage or income inequality is not rising nearly as fast as expenditure inequality. I certainly did agree with you in your article in part opposed that the way we measure it by expenditures probably isn't the right way to go. But expenditures inequality has really jumped from 33 to 41, as you said, whereas income inequality has only jumped from 41 to 44. What are the implications of that? I think there should be tremendous implications on what you do about inequality. And for Asep, it seems to me, maybe I'm wrong, please correct me if I'm wrong, but the fact that your effects were stronger on the exclusion dimension suggests that there's more intentionality than just poor measurement of who's eligible. And I wondered if you had any thoughts. I know that you want to resist attempts to talk about causes, but I'm going to ask the question again anyway. Is this in part of the fact that the elites or the non-poor are still driving political processes, and therefore it's important to distribute some of these benefits to them? Do they have more political power? And if that's the case, how does the recent change away from direct elections suggest what may happen going forward in terms of intentional or I should say exclusionary inequality? And then this goes back to a point that someone else asked. Well, if that's the case, maybe we do need to better understand inequality in that period before 2005, before the institutions of democracy really took firmer root. Because if we're going back to the days of indirect elections, are we going back to the days where the kinds of things that existed then are more important than what we've experienced in Indonesia in more recent years? Thank you.
I'm Jackie Pomeroy, and I'm working with the World Bank with PSF on working on livelihood issues. I have two sets of questions. The first one is for you, Athia. And I really liked the focus on education. But I have a problem with the inequality measured as years of schooling. And that problem comes out in the first part of the table, the predictive table that you put up there, where you noted that Jakarta was all of the portions of Jakarta were down in the lower right-hand section. To me, that makes sense. But if you
and still a little bit technical. Asep, you argue that the inequality will have better target performance, but better target performance will also have reducing inequality. So there's a reversal causality there, and there's possible of problem of homogeneity. And I didn't see that in your presentations. I understand that you in your paper you mentioned this is only relationship, it's positively associated with high inequality and target performance, not causal. But implicitly in your conclusions, I get that implicitly you say that there's a causal impact between the inequality and target performance. So my question is, why don't you try to treat this problem and build a stronger relationship, a causal relationship between inequality and the target performance? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Mas Wiwan. And now I probably from Asep first to respond to the question, and then continue with Athia and Zulfan. Thank you.
Thank you, Bima. There are many questions for me. The first question from Jeff on the implications of the current change from direct to indirect elections. That really need deep thinking, yeah. And I think I will not be able to answer satisfactorily in a short time. But my take of that is that it really is a setback for the poor. Yeah. Because with direct elections, the poor have more direct say on the fate of the elite. So they have more bargaining power actually to get more benefits. But with indirect elections, that power has disappeared. Yeah. It becomes completely a game between the elites and the other elites. And the poor is only occasionally have influence when there is an election, but even that's only indirectly because they don't really elect the leaders. Yeah. So we may have seen some backlash on even worse targeting and distributions of benefits to the poor because of that. Yeah. But that maybe takes some time to observe. Yeah, to think. What about Jackie? Between the difference between targeting and distributions, what we actually have in the data is the distribution. Okay. And for the targeting, we actually calculate from that. Yeah. Because we don't know actually whether this household is in the target list or not. But we know whether they actually receive the benefit or not. But then we calculate their positions in the rank, and based on that, we determine whether they are not in the list or not. So I think that's our approach to that. In there, they actually the locals still have some power in influencing targeting because as we see during the data collections, the enumerator consulted with the local leaders about the list of the poor. So that's where their role playing. But of course, it's much smaller compared to Raskin because in Raskin, they actually the one who distribute the benefits. On the implication of Undang-Undang Desa, that also another worry. Yeah. I think we need to put a lot of safeguarding mechanisms to make sure that the elite culture does not really distort the benefit from the fund transfer to the villages from due to this law. Otherwise, we will see the same, maybe even worse than the targeting over there, yeah, that we have seen so far. Right? Exactly. Yeah. For Pak Firman, on the agility issue, we have thought about this before we did the estimations. And the conclusion was that we were not really worried about heterogeneity. Why? Because on the one hand, the impact of inequality on targeting is immediate. Yeah. On the other hand, the impact of targeting on inequality takes some time or even a long time. So since we only use cross-section data, we are not too worried about the backward effect from inequality from targeting to inequality. I think that's the answer. Thank you.
Related to a question from Jeffrey about whether when we choose horizontal inequality rather than relative deprivation in our estimation. Well, our motivation actually owed to the papers by Professor Stewart and friends from Oxford that they try to look at horizontal inequalities because the people's well-being is not only affected by individual condition, but also their relative circumstances in their group. This is actually related also to the social networking. So maybe we assume that district which has more heterogeneity in terms of maybe ethnic, with kind of there is a competition between ethnics to grow within each other in the districts. So that is our motivation, and yes, indeed, these horizontal inequalities firstly pioneered by the Professor Stewart and their friends in Oxford, actually to look at the impact of inequality on the impact of horizontal inequality on the conflict. But then we try to replicate this. Why don't we try this variable, this new variables, horizontal inequalities, which is quite new, measures, to also look at the impact of horizontal inequalities on prosperity measures. So it's kind of, coba-coba Pak. So this is, I think, the first one, no, maybe the first one, yeah, if I'm too optimistic, the study that used the horizontal inequality to measure the impact on prosperity measures. For Ibu Jackie, thank you for your critical views, Bu. But yeah, to be honest, we haven't had any exploration on how every district do in their district. I mean, what is the reason why these districts are inequality is high, but growth is high as well. But maybe for the one that you said in the district in Papua as well as in Jakarta, we can see that those districts are outlier. Yeah. In Jakarta they have higher inequality but reducing growth, and then the district in Papua lower inequality but higher growth. My anecdotal comments may be that this district in Papua are, there is more Pemekaran in Papua. This district are new and they are growing very fast. But with the Gini within the district is quite low. So I think this is my short explanation for this condition. Thank you.
Okay, to continue the discussions about horizontal inequality and relative deprivations, if I may continue discussions from Athia, if each of us, three of us here, representing three things, stability, prosperity, and targeting, from the stability side, I would claim that horizontal inequality is the most relevant for stability rather than the other three, if I may claim like this. So, this is a very new area of research, relatively new, only in the past 10, 12 years. And basically, the concern about horizontal inequality in relation to conflict or violent conflict is in the context of the grievance explanation, grievance theory of conflict, vis-a-vis the greed theory. So within the grievance theory, in another study, we can subdivide the grievance theory of conflict into three things. One is horizontal inequality, the second one is relative deprivations, and the third one is polarization. Of course, the three are not mutually exclusive, and to be honest, technically speaking, all three measures are very tricky. Just to concentrate on horizontal inequality and relative deprivations, there have been several attempts to arrive at comparable cross-country measures on the one, but none of them have reached the level, the satisfactory level. So the conclusion so far is, if you want to look at horizontal inequality or relative deprivations, the best way is to do within country analysis rather than cross-country. So that's what I can say about the state of knowledge now, about because this is about concept, and this is about how empirically the concept is translated into the acceptable, rigorous measures. Like Gini coefficient is very much well established, but not in the case of horizontal inequality. If I have another more minute to explain about this one, there are many ways to measure horizontal inequality. And when you look at the trend of the horizontal inequality, you can interpret that one as relative deprivations. So, in another study of conflict in Indonesia, I argue that empirically back that argument is that relative deprivations can happen in the context of both widening horizontal inequality as well as converging horizontal inequality. So this is unique to Indonesia, if you like. So, but this is beyond the scope of the current paper, and we can read my other papers on that one. So, another findings about relative deprivation. Relative deprivations, you can see relative deprivations in time horizon. The movement of relative positions of group vis-a-vis other groups. That's one way to look at relative deprivations. And the second way is, you can look at also relative deprivations in the context of internal achievement of a group. What do you mean internal achievement? Think of, if you are having higher educations, your expectation is you should be able to lower your poverty level, or you should be able to raise your income. But achieving higher educations with lowering poverty and achieving higher income can be completely different. So in this kind of exercise, in the context of ethnic violence in Indonesia during the democratic transitions, in another study again, I have calculated the index of relative deprivations internal to each, in particular each district in Indonesia, measuring the level of comparing the achievement in terms of educations and achievement in terms of poverty reductions in each district. So the finding was, we find the term of educated but poor. So in districts where the level of, they are relatively educated, but relatively poor, educated but poor. So you can see here the applications of the concept of relative deprivations. in the index of the higher district with higher index of relativity professions in the context of educated but poor, you will find higher level of bias during the progressive transition. So that's what I can comment about horizontal inequality and relativity professions. On your second concern about differentiating wage inequality, not wage, earning inequality to be more precise, and the inequality in terms of expenditure, we have to be careful here. The diagram that I showed before, we have the official measures of consumption expenditure inequality, but we don't have any official measures published by BBS about Gini coefficients of earnings. I think I can claim now. The calculations that I showed you was the first calculations of Gini in terms of earnings inequality. We need to understand here, when we talk about expenditure inequality, this is about the whole household in Indonesia. I mean, sample of households representing the whole household in Indonesia. But if you look at the source of data for earnings, the earnings data only available for roughly 2/3 of total employment. And the most important earnings that categorically excluded in the Sakarnas was the earnings of the employers, the 3% of total employment. Employers is who own businesses. So if you think of wealthy businessmen in Indonesia, employers who pay wage to the employees, their earnings are calculated in the Sakarnas. They are left out. So the earnings data only available for roughly 2/3 of total employment. I think that's one of the possible explanations. Yeah. So on adding to this one, the higher level of, if you have consumptions and you have income, and the best indicator to proxy income now is earnings from Sakarnas. So we find that inequality in earnings is higher than consumptions. But if you want to move a little bit higher, we need to look at wealth, accumulations of income over time. So if you look at that one, I'm sure that the level of inequality in Indonesia could be comparable to the level of inequality in South Asia or could be Latin America.
Okay, thank you very much, Mas Zulfan, Mbak Athia, and Pak Asep. So I think the time is up and we are at the end of our seminar. And I think the presentation and also the discussion that we just had now is that shows us that there are some areas inequality that we need to be further discussed and studied in order to learn how these various types of inequality may affect different aspects in our life. And in that way, then the government, the policymakers, can develop proper policies and programs to address the problem. So, before I close the seminar, I want to remind you that the next seminar of the Forum Kajian Pembangunan will be the speaker of the next seminar will be Ross McLeod from the Australian National University. And the next seminar will be on this Thursday, October 16, and it will be held at the SMERU office in Jalan Cikini Raya, number 10A. And let's close this seminar by giving a big applause to all speakers.
I would like to inform you that the seminar is recorded and it will be uploaded by Indonesia Project and it will be available on their website. It will also be available on SMERU's website, YouTube channel, youtube.com/SMERU Institute. invited outside. I think you could take this opportunity to interact with other participants or you can ask more questions to the speakers.